There's a quiet war we all fight, not in boardrooms or battlefields, but within our minds, every time someone tries to provoke us. You see, the most dangerous person in any room isn't the loudest or the one who talks over everyone. It's the one who remains unfazed while chaos erupts around them. That person, unmoved and calm, holds more power than words can explain. Because power doesn't always look like shouting or storming out of the room. Sometimes, true power is the ability to say nothing at all, to choose stillness over reaction. Every time you react to a toxic person, you hand over a piece of yourself, your peace, your clarity, your emotional sovereignty. But every time you breathe and stay grounded, they lose their grip. Their chaos spirals into confusion because your silence speaks a language they never learned: self-mastery. When someone triggers you, it's not always about them. Often, it's a reflection of where your mind still hasn't found peace. Imagine walking into a meeting where someone you work with, let's call her Karen, takes a subtle jab. She doesn't name you directly, but her words carry that sharp edge that cuts with precision. Something like, "Well, some of us double-check our work." You know exactly what she means. Your stomach tightens, your heart beats faster, and every part of you wants to snap back, to prove your competence, to defend your pride. But what if you didn't? What if you just paused, inhaled deeply, looked her in the eye, not with fury, but with stillness? Your voice remains steady, your posture unbothered. You continue your point with clarity and composure. That's not suppression, that's strength. It's the kind of strength that isn't taught in school, but forged in fire. Emotional intelligence isn't about bottling up your feelings until you explode. It's about understanding your emotions so well that they no longer own you. It's about choosing your response like a warrior selects their weapon. Not every fight is worth swinging for. When you stay calm, toxic people will escalate. They'll push harder, louder, trying to break the silence you've armored yourself with. But the more they yell, the more they unravel. Because your calm exposes their chaos. They're not looking for truth. They're addicted to attention. And when you stop reacting, you cut off their supply. Most people live like emotional puppets. A sarcastic comment can ruin their day. A single message triggers hours of overthinking. A guilt trip from someone close sends them spiraling into self-doubt. But there's a path beyond that. A path taught by those who've walked through storms and found stillness on the other side. The Stoics knew this. They knew that you cannot control others. You can only master your reaction. Epictetus once said, "It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about them." That judgment, that internal story we tell ourselves, is what creates suffering. So how do you deal with the toxic voices around you? Not by fighting louder, but by starving them of what they feed on: your energy, your validation, your emotional response. You don't need to yell. You don't need to argue. You don't need to make a dramatic exit. What you need is discipline. The kind of discipline that says, "My peace is not on the table." Because once you master that, no storm can reach you. Imagine walking through a battlefield where insults fly like arrows, but you're wrapped in an armor of calm so thick, none of it pierces your soul. That's not delusion, that's evolution. Here's where the transformation begins. Every emotional outburst you avoid is a deposit into your inner bank of power. Every moment you choose silence over reaction is a step toward mastery. You begin to notice patterns, the way toxic people provoke, the tones they use, the passive-aggressive jabs. You see the game for what it is. And when you stop playing, they lose their audience. Their power was never in what they said, it was in how much of yourself you gave to it. And when you choose not to give, you reclaim every piece they tried to take. Think about the last time you felt manipulated, when someone said something that dug deep, twisted your reality, or made you question your worth. Did you react? Did you explain yourself? Did you spiral? Or did you pause, breathe, and observe? That moment, right there, is where your growth lives. Because every time you respond with clarity instead of emotion, you train your mind to lead, not follow. And toxic people, they don't know what to do with that. They rely on your reaction to feel powerful. They poke, prod, and provoke, waiting for you to explode so they can play the victim. But when you stay calm, you expose them, not with words, but with presence. You don't need to explain yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to justify your boundaries to those who only cross them. You don't need to keep proving your worth in rooms where your silence speaks louder. When someone pokes at your insecurities, they're looking for a wound to exploit. But when you've healed, there's nothing left to grab onto. You become untouchable, not by closing yourself off, but by opening a space within that no one can enter without permission. And here's what happens when you stop reacting. You stop bleeding power. You stop handing out emotional access like free samples. You become selective, not in a cold way, but in a conscious one. Not everyone deserves your energy. Not every battle is meant to be fought. Some are meant to be walked past with a smile that says, I know who I am, and I don't need to prove it. That's the essence of becoming unshakable. It's not about being emotionless, it's about becoming emotionally wise. It's about knowing when to speak and when silence says more. It's about choosing stillness over chaos, not because you're weak, but because you finally remembered that peace is the real prize. Toxic people want to rent space in your mind, but you decide who gets to stay. And the strongest eviction notice you can serve is no reaction at all. So ask yourself, in the moments where chaos knocks on your door, who are you going to be? The one who opens and invites it in? Or the one who stands quietly at the threshold and says, not today? This is where your power lives, not in the roar of retaliation, but in the calm of knowing who you are. Let's begin with a reality most never want to admit. Toxic people are not powerful. They are not masterminds. They are not emotionally superior. In fact, they are usually insecure, manipulative, and practiced. That's the only thing they have that you might not. Practice. They've been doing it for so long that emotional manipulation has become their native language. They've memorized which tones create guilt, which silences make you nervous, which words will hit you in that exact soft spot of vulnerability. You're not losing because you're weak. You're losing because they've trained and you haven't. It's like stepping into a boxing ring with a professional when you've never even taken off your gloves. You're not bad, you're untrained. And if you keep walking into these emotional battles unprepared, the bruises won't stop. But Stoics don't blame the opponent, they train for the fight. Picture this, you're in a conversation with someone who always manages to flip the script. They cross the line and you try to talk it out, only to find yourself apologizing for a wound you didn't cause. You try again, calmer this time, hoping this time they'll understand. But they twist your words, again. They take your vulnerability and use it like a weapon, again. They take your kindness and read it as weakness, again. That's not a miscommunication. That's a program. That's a pattern. That's a toxic loop, and you've been trapped in it because part of you still hopes for resolution, but that resolution isn't coming. Because toxic people aren't seeking peace, they're seeking power. So how do you break the cycle? You stop responding, not out of hate, not to play games, but to finally choose yourself. The old version of you, full of explanations, always chasing understanding, trying to keep the peace, dies the moment you say, I don't owe anyone access to my emotional world. And when that shift happens, you go from prey to presence. You stop reacting and start observing. You stop spinning in their storm and become the eye of it. That's the moment you write your own rules. Because emotional strength, like any strength, is built in silence. It's trained, it's chosen. You don't build this kind of strength by reading motivational quotes or reposting mental health affirmations. You build it in the heat of the moment. When someone tests your limits and you don't take the bait. When someone calls you names, accuses you, blames you, and instead of unraveling, you breathe. You hold your posture. You say, this conversation isn't productive, and you walk away. That's self-mastery. That's what it means to be untouchable. Not because you never feel, but because you no longer fall. You'll start to notice something incredible. The calmer you become, the more chaotic they get. Your peace becomes their panic. Your stillness becomes their struggle. Why? Because they can't survive in a space where manipulation doesn't work. They don't know how to function without control. And when you stop responding, they lose the script. You'll see it in real time. The guilt trips will intensify. The manipulation will get louder. They'll reach deeper into your past, insult the parts of you you've worked hardest to heal, poke at every scar. Not because they're angry, but because they're losing you. Because without your pain, they lose their control. You ever notice how a toxic ex suddenly cares once you've stopped caring? Not when you were crying, not when you were explaining, but when you finally stopped responding. That's when they text. That's when they double down. That's when they act confused. You've changed. This isn't like you. But it is like you. It's just not the version of you they could manipulate. And now they're scrambling, because they're not checking in out of love. They're checking if your boundary is real. They're testing if your silence is strength or temporary distance. And this is where most people crack. They mistake chaos for connection. They confuse someone chasing them with someone caring for them. But the Stoic knows, noise is not love, peace is. You've grown, and they're not arguing with the new you. They're arguing with the version of you that needed validation, the one who feared abandonment, the one who over-explained and undervalued themselves just to keep the peace. But that version no longer exists. And now all that's left is stillness. And stillness terrifies the chaotic, because it reflects everything they've tried to avoid, every insecurity, every emptiness, every fear. You're not triggering them, you're showing them a mirror, and they can't stand what they see. But don't mistake your silence for apathy. It's not that you don't care, it's that you care more about your peace than their performance. Toxic people are actors. They rehearse drama. They write scripts in their head where they're always the victim. They practice lines that turn blame into guilt. But they can't perform without an audience. And when you stop giving your applause, their stage collapses. So what does that look like in everyday life? It looks like reading a passive-aggressive text and choosing not to answer. It looks like standing in a room where someone throws a verbal jab and you smile, not with bitterness, but with peace, and say nothing. It looks like walking away from the need to explain, defend, or convince. Not because you've shut down, but because you've opened up to a higher version of yourself. One who doesn't trade peace for participation in someone else's emotional chaos. You become aware of the cost. Every text you respond to out of guilt costs you energy. Every conversation you entertain to be nice drains your focus. Every argument you engage in to prove your worth robs you of clarity. And so you stop spending your attention on people who treat it like it's free, because your energy isn't a public resource. It's sacred, and your boundaries are the gates. This is the core of emotional discipline. The knowing that not every invitation deserves a response, that you can sit in discomfort without trying to fix it, that you can let people misinterpret you, misunderstand you, even dislike you, without needing to set the record straight, because you know who you are. And when you truly know, their opinion stops mattering. So the next time chaos knocks, don't open the door, let it knock. Let it get louder. Let it scream into the hallway. But you stay inside your peace. You sit in your quiet, you remind yourself, I'm not reacting because I'm afraid. I'm calm because I've trained for this. That's the shift. That's the moment you win. Not because you destroyed them, but because you didn't need to. Because they have no power where your mind no longer lives. And in that silence, you become a force that no storm can touch. Now imagine this, the people who once had emotional control over you, those whose words twisted your mind, whose silence made you question your worth, whose chaos you mistook for care, suddenly find themselves standing in front of someone they can no longer manipulate. Someone who sees the game for what it is and refuses to play. Someone who doesn't clap when they perform, doesn't flinch when they insult, and doesn't collapse when they walk away. That someone is you. You've probably been in that space before, where you block the number, delete the photos, clean out the messages, and swear to yourself, I'm done. But the next morning, their words still echo in your head. You're too sensitive, they said. No one else would put up with you, they insisted. And a part of you wonders, what if they were right? That's the illusion. That's not healing, that's mental captivity. You've left the room, but they're still speaking through the walls of your own mind. And that is the final chain. Your craving for their validation, your need for their apology, your hope that one day they'll say, I was wrong. But here's the truth, they won't. Not because they don't know they hurt you, but because they don't care that they did. Let that sink in. It's not that they don't see it, it's that they saw it and stepped on it anyway. And once you realize that, you stop waiting. You stop hoping for closure from someone who benefits from your confusion. You stop rehearsing what you would say if they finally gave you 5 minutes of honesty. Because that moment, it's never coming. But your peace, that's already within you if you stop giving it away. Detachment isn't cold, it's clear. It's the moment you look at someone who used to unravel you and feel nothing. Not hate, not bitterness, just peace. You no longer need to prove you're a good person to someone committed to misunderstanding you. You just breathe, you just move, you just let go. That's not weakness, that's self-respect. There's a strange kind of grief that comes when you stop chasing people who don't care. Not because you miss them, but because you miss the version of yourself who believed they did. That version of you, the one who tolerated crumbs, begged for connection, and gave more than they got, that version was trying. But that version wasn't trained. That version didn't yet know that not everyone deserves a front row seat to your life. And that's where you are now, deciding who gets access, who gets energy, who gets proximity. Not because you're building walls, but because you're finally learning to build doors that lock. And it's not just about cutting people off. It's about cutting off the replay, the late-night thoughts, the imaginary arguments, the mental theater where they're still on stage. Every time you replay what they said, what they did, how they hurt you, you're handing them the mic. You're giving them airtime in a show they should have been written out of long ago. You're rehearsing their lines like they deserve to be remembered. But they don't. They don't deserve your rumination. They don't deserve your mental rent. They don't deserve your midnight tears. What they deserve is your silence. What they deserve is your absence. What they deserve is to be forgotten. And here's the wild part. When you truly stop reacting, they start unraveling. Toxic people thrive in emotional engagement. It doesn't matter if the reaction is anger, sadness, or fear. It's all fuel to them. So when you no longer respond to their texts, when you no longer correct their lies, when you no longer rush to prove your side, they panic. Not because they love you, but because they've lost control. And control, not connection, was always the point. They may lash out louder. They may play the victim harder. They may say things that hit where it still hurts. You never cared. You're so selfish. You've changed. But the truth is, they're not angry that you've changed. They're angry that their tactics no longer work. That's when you know you've healed. Not when they're quiet, but when you are. When their chaos no longer pulls you, when their words hit the wall of your peace and fall silent. That's when you've built something unbreakable. Because Stoicism isn't about suppressing emotion. It's about selecting it. You don't respond because they're not worth the price. You don't engage because your attention is currency. And you don't explain yourself because your worth is no longer on trial. You don't beg. You don't chase. You don't defend. You exist. You thrive. You grow. And they lose the privilege of being part of your growth. And they'll notice. Oh, they'll notice. You'll hear from them again, not out of love, but out of habit, out of curiosity, out of desperation to see if the door is still open. They'll send vague messages. Hope you're doing okay. Miss the old times. Funny how life turns out. And you'll know. You'll know it's not a check-in. It's a test. It's bait. It's their way of seeing if you're still willing to participate in their script. And you won't be. Not because you're cruel, but because you're healed. And healing doesn't require applause. It requires boundaries. And that's what you have now. You are not cold. You are not bitter. You are not closed off. You are simply done being emotionally available to people who bankrupt your spirit. You don't need to scream to be heard. You don't need to post quotes to prove you've moved on. You don't need to win the breakup, the argument, or the battle for narrative. Because the real victory is peace. And peace never needs to announce itself. It just is. So take your power back, not with fire, but with silence. Not with rage, but with stillness. Not by proving them wrong, but by becoming someone they can no longer disturb. That's the shift, that's the point. That's how you stop bleeding energy into people who never deserve your light. You rise, you evolve, and you leave them behind. Not because you hated them, but because you finally loved yourself enough to walk away. It's a strange sensation when the people who once seemed so powerful, so captivating, so capable of bending your emotions in a single phrase, suddenly feel small. Not because they've changed, but because you have. Not because they stopped being toxic, but because you stopped being available. And in that space between reaction and restraint, something powerful happens. You meet the version of yourself they never wanted you to become. Independent, aware, and untouchable. This isn't about cutting ties just to prove a point. It's not about slamming doors or making grand exits. That's drama. That's still being part of the show. No, this is different. This is the kind of departure that doesn't make noise, it just makes peace. It's you closing the chapter in your heart, not just in your phone. It's no more rehearsing what you should have said. No more writing messages you never send. No more scanning your memory for moments you can reframe to make them look better than they were. This is real healing. Not the kind where you move on with resentment, but the kind where you move on because you've outgrown the need for resolution. You'll feel it when you stop caring whether they ever understand your side. When their silence doesn't sting, their opinions don't weigh you down, their presence or absence no longer affects your emotional climate. That's when you've built the fortress, the one no storm can enter. That's when the battle ends. Not because they surrendered, but because you walked off the field. You'll notice how quiet the world becomes when you stop reacting. How drama fades when you no longer give it a stage. How guilt loses its grip when you no longer believe you owe anyone your peace. The same words that used to destroy your day now sound hollow. The same manipulation that used to send you spiraling now sounds predictable. Because you've started to see clearly, this was never about love. It was about power. And once you stop giving it, they stop knowing what to do with you. There's no reward for over-explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. No gold star for being the one who always tries to make peace with those who thrive on war. What you do get, however, is your life back. Your nights back, your clarity back. You wake up one day and you're not checking your phone for their message. You're not replaying your last interaction on a loop. You're not wondering what you could have done differently. Because finally you understand what you did was enough. Who you were was enough. And their failure to see it was their flaw, not your failure. And let's be honest, this isn't about just one person. This is about a pattern, a tendency, a conditioning that taught you to earn love by performing, by pleasing, by explaining, by reacting. That taught you that silence was dangerous, that being misunderstood meant you were wrong, that the absence of chaos meant something was missing. But now you know better. You know that silence isn't absence, it's power. That not every argument needs a reply. That some people aren't meant to understand you. And more importantly, that their understanding is no longer your responsibility. The moment you stop trying to change them and start changing your boundaries, you shift the entire dynamic. It's not about fixing them, it's about strengthening you. It's about building such a deep well of inner clarity that their chaos can't even reach the surface. And yes, they'll notice. They'll notice when their words don't land the same, when their silence doesn't sting, when their attempts to bait you fall flat. And in that moment, they'll realize you're not reacting, not because you don't care, but because you care too much about yourself now to hand over your peace like it's disposable. You don't need to announce your transformation. Real strength doesn't need to post about how unbothered it is. Real strength doesn't clap back. It doesn't retaliate. It doesn't need a mic. It just walks, quietly, steadily, forward. And as you do, you'll feel the weight fall away. The emotional knots begin to loosen. You'll stop romanticizing their potential and start accepting their reality. You'll stop longing for closure and start realizing you were the closure all along. You don't need to be chosen by someone who never saw you. You need to choose yourself with such conviction that their absence becomes irrelevant. Not bitter, not angry, just irrelevant. Because your peace was never supposed to be dependent on someone else's presence. That's the shift from codependency to clarity, from being triggered to being trained, from hoping for change to becoming change. And don't be surprised when they come back. They often do. Not because they've changed, but because they miss the access they once had. They miss the version of you who over-explained, over-gave, overstayed. But they don't miss you. They miss your compliance, your emotional availability, your predictable reactions. But that version of you, you've buried them. Not with hate, with growth. They might call it cold, they might call it fake, they might say you've changed, and you'll nod because you have. You've changed the way you see yourself, the way you protect your energy, the way you allow access to your heart. And no, they won't understand it, but that's okay. They don't have to. Understanding isn't required for your evolution. Only discipline is. The discipline to stay silent when chaos knocks, to stay grounded when drama dances, to walk away when your peace is at stake. Because ultimately, this isn't about them. It never was. This is about you, about choosing clarity over confusion, stillness over noise, strength over reaction. And once you make that choice, consistently, deliberately, and without apology, you become someone they can no longer reach, not because you built a wall, but because you built a home inside yourself. And not everyone deserves a key. That's the lesson. That's the journey. That's the transformation. To go from being emotionally reactive to emotionally sovereign. To no longer be owned by people who only wanted access to you when it benefited them. To no longer be a participant in a play you never agreed to. And that kind of power, it's not loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't perform. It just is. There comes a moment in everyone's life when silence becomes sacred, not just a lack of words, but the loudest boundary you've ever set. It's the invisible wall between your old self, the one who bent to accommodate chaos, who tried to fix what didn't want to be fixed, and your new self, who finally realized that peace is worth protecting, even if it means walking away from people you once would have burned yourself out, trying to understand. You don't respond to their texts, not out of pettiness, but because your healing has reached a place where their noise doesn't deserve your clarity. You don't explain yourself anymore, not because you don't care, but because you finally care too much to keep begging someone to value what they're committed to misunderstanding. And that shift, that deep, soul-rooted shift, it doesn't scream. It whispers. It moves like water, slowly, reshaping everything it touches until your inner world no longer trembles at their storms. You begin to understand that healing is not about detaching from people out of anger. It's about detaching out of alignment. You don't need revenge. You don't need an audience. You need a mirror and the honesty to tell yourself, I deserve more. More than late-night manipulation disguised as love. More than friendships built on obligation instead of mutual respect. More than being more than drained just to keep someone else from unraveling. And when that truth lands, you don't need to convince anyone else. You just act. You just choose. You just move forward with a quiet knowing that your peace is no longer negotiable. And when the silence grows heavy, when the guilt tries to creep in, because it always will, you remind yourself, guilt is not a compass. Sometimes it's just a ghost, a residue of the old version of you, still trying to earn love by sacrificing yourself. But you don't live there anymore. You don't speak the language of appeasement. You speak boundaries now. You speak discernment. You speak with your actions, with your absence, with the stillness of someone who no longer needs to perform pain to feel seen. There's this myth that silence is weakness, that if you're not reacting, you're retreating, that if you're not defending, you're surrendering. But what the world often forgets is that silence, intentional, grounded, deeply rooted silence, isn't weakness at all. It's a message. It says, you don't have access here anymore. It says your power over me has expired. It says, I'm no longer available to play the game you keep trying to drag me into. And yes, they'll notice. They always do. Not right away, not when you first walk away, but when the energy shift becomes undeniable, when their usual tactics fall flat, when they realize you no longer flinch, no longer chase, no longer perform the dance of emotional confusion. That's when they panic. Not because they care, but because they lost control. But you're not theirs to control anymore. You belong to yourself now. Your mornings don't start with overthinking their silence. Your nights don't end with drafting responses in your mind to conversations that won't happen. You're not rehearsing the next emotional negotiation. You're resting. You're realigning. You're rediscovering the parts of you that were buried beneath years of bending, breaking, and trying too hard. And slowly, the weight lifts. The fog clears. You laugh a little louder. You sleep a little deeper. You start to feel like yourself, not the version they shaped with their disapproval, but the version that existed before you ever needed their approval in the first place. That's rebirth. That's healing. That's the silent, stunning evolution of someone who chose themselves without needing permission. Because here's the truth no one teaches you. The moment you stop reacting, you stop bleeding power. Every time you withhold your response, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Every time you resist the urge to prove your worth, you strengthen it. And every time you choose silence over chaos, you declare, not to them, but to yourself, that you are no longer available for the kind of life that shrinks you. They might call it cold, let them. They might say you've changed, let them. They might twist the story, rewrite the history. Stayed. How many chances you gave, how many times you swallowed your pain just to keep the peace. And now, finally, you're done. Not out of hate, out of self-respect. And that, more than anything, is what terrifies them. Not your silence, not your absence, but the fact that you no longer need them to be okay. That your peace no longer depends on their presence. That they can't reach you anymore. Not because you built walls, but because you've risen to a place they never had the discipline to climb. You didn't abandon them, you just stopped abandoning yourself. So here you are now, steady, grounded, unapologetic, no longer needing closure, no longer waiting for the apology, no longer rehearsing your worth for someone who never truly saw it. And in that stillness, in that unwavering calm, you've become the kind of person they can no longer manipulate, no longer rattle, no longer own. You've become untouchable. Only one part remains, the final reminder, the quietest and strongest lesson of all. The final reminder is not loud, not dramatic, and not something you'll find written in flashing lights. It's subtle. It's quiet. It moves through you like a whisper you've known your whole life but only now understand. It's this: your greatest power isn't how much you fight to be seen, but how deeply you choose to see yourself. That's the difference between reacting and rising, between living in the noise and mastering the silence. The ones who hurt you, who tried to manipulate, twist, control, they didn't win because they hurt you. Pain is not defeat. Pain is just the first signal that something within you is ready to transform. The real victory is when you decide to no longer let that pain define you. When you stop telling the story from their perspective and start telling it from yours. Not the victim's story, not the survivor's story, but the story of the one who remembered their own strength in the middle of the storm. The one who realized they didn't need to react to be powerful. They just needed to stop giving away their peace like it was a negotiation. And here's the thing no one tells you. When you stop reacting, they don't just lose control over you. They lose control over themselves. Because toxic people, people who thrive on reaction, chaos, guilt, and drama, they've built their entire emotional script around you, playing a part. And when you stop playing, their script falls apart. That's not just uncomfortable for them, that's terrifying. Because now they're left with the only thing they can't control, themselves. And in that silence, that stillness you've chosen, something incredible happens. You begin to rebuild, not from a place of spite, not from a need to show them how well you're doing, but from a space that's never been tainted by their presence. You start to listen to yourself again, the parts of you that were silenced, the instincts you ignored, the boundaries you bent. You come home to yourself, and this time, no one else holds the keys. Your days start to fill with moments of clarity. You see the manipulation before it even begins. You feel the old triggers coming, but they no longer land. The words that once pierced now pass through like wind, not because you're numb, but because you're healed. You don't need to perform strength. You are strength. Not the kind that roars, but the kind that walks away without a single crack in its voice. There's a dignity in that, a nobility. Not everyone will understand it. Not everyone will respect it, but you don't need them to, because your self-worth is no longer tied to how others treat you or how loud you are in response. It's tied to how well you protect your peace, how fiercely you preserve your stillness, how intentionally you choose your energy every day, every hour, every moment. They may still try. Send a message, drop a comment, make a scene. Because when toxic people lose access to your emotions, they become desperate. Not because they care about you, but because they can no longer control the narrative. And when that happens, they may try to rewrite history. Twist the truth. Frame you as cold, cruel, distant. Let them. Because you no longer need to clear your name in a story that was never honest to begin with. You walk forward, silent, focused, alive. Every step away from the noise, every breath outside the battlefield, is a step towards something sacred. Freedom. True freedom. The kind that doesn't come from cutting people off or burning bridges, but from no longer needing anyone else's permission to choose peace. And here's the deeper truth. When you stop reacting, you don't just become untouchable to them. You become unshakable to the world. The boss who pushes your buttons, the friend who uses guilt to manipulate, the ex who keeps resurfacing hoping to get a rise out of you. They all lose their power when you remember yours. And your power was never in the volume of your voice. It was always in your ability to stay calm when everything around you is screaming for chaos. So don't apologize for the silence. Don't feel guilt for the stillness. Don't let anyone tell you that you become distant, cold, or hard to reach. You're not unreachable. You're just no longer available for the noise. You've upgraded your peace. You've chosen presence over performance. You've walked away, not in anger, but in alignment. Let them think what they want. Let them say what they will. That's their storm. You're not in it anymore. Because now, you know, real power isn't about being right. It's about being rooted. Not in other people's opinions, but in your own clarity. Not in constant reaction, but in unwavering resolve. Not in who you fight, but in what you no longer feed. You've become the calm in the storm, the silence in the chaos, the presence in the noise. And in that presence, you are finally, fully, and completely free. So the next time someone tries to pull you into their storm, remember this. You don't owe them your peace, your voice, or your energy. Your silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the echo of your growth, the sound of your evolution. When you stop reacting, you stop giving away the most powerful thing you have, control over yourself. And in that stillness, in that space where you no longer dance to anyone else's chaos, you find something extraordinary. Freedom. Not just freedom from them, but freedom from the version of you that used to need them. You don't need to win the argument. You already won the war the moment you chose peace over proving a point. That's what it means to be untouchable. And that's who you've become. Now go live like it.